My name is Harper Collins, and at 34 years old, I became, just last week, the youngest admiral the United States has ever appointed. Yet 2 evenings ago, I found myself sitting quietly at the far corner of a stretched family table, almost invisible, while the celebration circled entirely around my sister Lauren. They called her brilliant, a master strategist. My uncle lifted his glass toward her as though she had discovered fire itself. "She's a self-made woman," he declared with pride. My cousin chimed in, "Unlike some people, she knows how to see things through." Laughter rippled across the table. Even my mother allowed herself a faint, approving smile, something I hadn't seen aimed my way in over 11 years. I didn't answer. I forked my salad slowly, counting the tiny chips in the ceramic plate. When my 8-year-old nephew leaned close and asked, "Are you still working on that feelings project nobody wanted?" Something inside my chest gave way, not from humiliation, but from a sudden, sharp understanding. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Just as dessert was being served, my father reached for the remote. The TV in the living room flickered to life. It was meant to be nothing more than background noise, until it wasn't. A breaking news banner flashed, and a clean-cut anchor in a navy blue suit stared into the camera. "Tonight," he said, "we spotlight a story America needs to hear. Harper Collins, 34, has been confirmed as the youngest U.S. admiral in our nation's history after a classified strategic breakthrough credited with saving hundreds of lives in international operations." The air went still. Forks hovered mid-motion. My brother let his glass slip from his hand. Even my mother was struck silent. No one turned toward me, but I didn't need them to. I leaned back, folded my napkin, and in my head whispered the words I had carried for years, "Now you see me." I hadn't always been overlooked. I once wore my Navy uniform with pride, the weight of the shoulder bars solid against my skin. My service was in psychological operations, the gray zone of conflict, where intellect and emotion had to waltz without stepping on each other's toes. In the beginning, they admired my work. My analyses were precise, my instincts on point. Commanders sought my counsel before major deployments, especially in tense regions where understanding intentions meant the difference between disaster and diplomacy. But everything shifted after one mission. I challenged a planned raid, not because I was afraid, but because the intelligence felt wrong. Locals were signaling things we weren't catching. The data seemed too perfect. I urged caution. They called it hesitation. When I raised my concerns again, I was told I was letting compassion cloud my judgment. I requested a 75-hour delay. They branded me too delicate to lead. That label stuck like tar. 3 days later, the raid went forward. 4 civilians died. So did 2 of our own. No one came to clear my name. A scapegoat was needed, and I fit the part. They pulled me from field decisions, saying my role was no longer critical. Weeks later, the paperwork came, no hearing, no closure. When I came home that winter, my first family dinner was an echo of what would come to define our gatherings. My sister slid me a slice of pie and said, "Guess not everyone can handle pressure." My uncle laughed and quipped, "You should have been a therapist or maybe a secretary." The table roared. I smiled like it didn't sting, but deep down, something shut tight. I didn't ask for understanding. I stopped trying to be seen. No more social media, no more Navy ties, no family updates. They assumed I'd fallen apart. The truth was, I'd begun building something they could neither ridicule nor predict. People thought I'd been discharged in disgrace. They were wrong. I had stepped away, under direct request from a program that didn't officially exist. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I returned from my final debrief and found 2 men in plain clothes waiting. No rank insignias, just a slim silver envelope and one question: "Would you help us create something quieter?" I didn't ask for explanations then. Within weeks, I was gone. No base, no uniform, no contact with the life I knew. That's where EMR began, emotional mapping response. Not a weapon, but a lens, a way to detect intent, fear and instability across a battlefield. Not through satellites or drones, but through micro-behaviors, biometric fluctuations, and emotional imprints. We built it to protect, not punish. To sense the tremor in a voice before a bomb was wired, to recognize the look in a child's eyes before the wrong side claimed him. To see before the point of no return. But here was the catch, it wasn't mine on paper. My name was on no patent, no press release. Every credit I signed away in exchange for one thing: anonymity. I picked impact over recognition. Years of refining the algorithm followed, feeding it every insight, every wound, even the patterns I recognized in my own family's rejection. When the system launched under someone else's name, I didn't blink. I knew what it could do, and I didn't need public applause. Not yet. My departure hadn't been a disgrace, it had been an erasure in slow motion. First they excluded me from briefings, then meetings, and finally told me my clearance was under alignment review. That's when I stood in Captain Donovan's office. He didn't stand. He didn't offer me a chair. He just pointed at a single line on a paper, looking at me like I was a problem no one wanted to solve. "You think too much," he said flatly. "Officers don't get to second-guess the emotions of enlisted men. We need movement, not interpretation." I stood at attention, silent. They cry. They panic. They break. "Fine," he continued. "But your job isn't to feel it. It's to push through it. If you can't, we'll find someone who will." That should have ended it. But I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Sir, maybe if someone had interpreted sooner, they wouldn't be breaking now." He said nothing. Just signed the paper that sealed my reassignment. But I didn't waste that time sulking. I started watching quietly. At night, I'd notice the younger soldiers, the tremor in their hands before lights out, the emptiness in their eyes after mission briefings. The ones who broke down loudly weren't the only ones suffering. I kept a notebook. I tracked their speech, their posture, how some avoided mirrors while others couldn't look away. No one ever asked what I was working on. I was no longer in anyone's chain of command, but that didn't mean I was idle. I immersed myself in PTSD research, dug through declassified Cold War documents on emotional exhaustion, and studied biometric data from elite units. I even watched hours of footage from disaster zones, observing how aid workers carried trauma in their posture and their silences. It became obvious, emotional collapse wasn't random. It followed patterns. It could be charted. I began sketching the earliest versions of what would one day be the EMR grid, color-coded layers mapping volatility spikes, trigger points, coping mechanisms, and false indicators of stability. I linked it with linguistic patterns and vocal stress analysis. Gradually, a system began to take shape. One night, buried in the archives, I came across something that stopped me cold. A staff sergeant, one who had taken his own life just weeks after returning home, had logged 28 measurable behavioral shifts in his final week. 28. And no one flagged a single one. I didn't cry, and I didn't rage. I marked each one in red ink, then opened a fresh page and wrote a single question: what still can be caught? By the time those plainclothes officers, the same men with the silver envelope, approached me, I had compiled an entire binder on what I called emotional trace theory. And even after I accepted their classified offer, I kept researching in secret. The Navy had shown me their limits, but they had also shown me their blind spots. So no, I never truly left. I just stopped wearing the uniform. I kept watching, kept building, knowing that one day, what I'd learned would need to re-enter the world, where it could protect the ones no one else noticed. Where maybe it could protect me. The transition was unremarkable. No ceremony. No handshake. My records were buried under internal reclassification codes. My name scrubbed from personnel databases, my email deleted, photographs pulled from every archive. On paper, I ceased to exist. I became a shadow in a program so small it was known to only a few inside specialized behavioral units. No badge. No rank. Just a code and a room with a two-way mirror. For nearly 4 years, I worked from behind that glass. My domain wasn't weapons training, it was psychological readiness drills. We called them nonlinear immersion simulations. That's where EMR got tested, quietly, methodically, and ethically. I never told the recruits what I was tracking. I simply listened. I measured the rhythm of their speech, the tension in their pauses, the way they paced without realizing, the silence that fell too sharply. Every sigh, every shift in tone, was data. I observed over 250 participants, fresh recruits and seasoned veterans. Some broke quickly. Some hardened almost instantly. But some hid so well they vanished behind a practiced smile. Take Logan, for example. 23 years old. He'd been reclassified after a roadside blast shattered 3 ribs and fractured his femur. The injury wasn't the real concern. It was his laugh, too precise, too mechanical. His eyes would dim halfway through a sentence. His voice rose slightly at the end, like he was trying to convince himself he was fine. His EMR trace showed a faint orange, what we called emotional dissociation. He wasn't confronting his pain, he was outrunning it. Outwardly, there was no anger, no panic. But his inner rhythm was fractured. When I brought him in alone, he deflected with jokes, charm, and easy smiles. I showed him the grid and told him, "You're not broken, Logan. You're in denial. That's not weakness. That's survival." For a long moment, he stared. Then, almost in relief, he said, "So it's not just in my head." "No," I told him. "It's in your patterns, and patterns can be rewritten." That's when I understood something critical. I wasn't fixing anyone. I was giving them words for what they'd never been allowed to admit. Some cried. Some sat in stillness for hours. Some went back into the field sharper than before. That's how I knew EMR worked. Not because it made people whole, but because it gave them back to themselves. The system still didn't officially exist. It was buried under layers of non-disclosure and plausible deniability. But the lives it touched? They were real. And I kept every trace file, partly for proof, partly for reasons I couldn't yet name. Some nights, watching the monitors, I felt the pull to return to the outside world. But I wasn't ready. It would take a single unexpected request to pull me back into the open. It came on a Thursday, one of those days so ordinary you almost forget it's happening. I had just finished reviewing onboarding assessments for a new Energy One behavioral analytics unit when a coworker sent me a link. "Thought you might want to see this," the message read. No explanation, just a government seal and the title, Congressional Hearing, Innovation in National Defense Readiness. I clicked. The stream buffered slowly, filled with static, until the image cleared. A half-empty chamber of suits and uniforms. At the podium stood a figure I knew instantly, my sister Lauren. Her posture perfect, her tone crisp, carrying that same calculated warmth she used in interviews. She wore her signature navy blazer, the one she chose whenever she needed to appear authoritative yet approachable. Then I heard the words. "What you see behind me," she said, gesturing to a large screen, "is the Emotional Mapping Response Framework, EMR. I stopped breathing. Developed through our Joint Civilian-Military Communications Division," she continued, "EMR enables us to identify pre-traumatic disruption patterns in real time. It gives commanders the ability to foresee mental vulnerability without interrupting operational flow. No mention of neural trace metrics. No reference to behavioral drift vectors. And no mention of me. It was a collaborative effort," she added smoothly. "But I was proud to lead the communications alignment team that first recognized its integration potential." On the screen was my system, trimmed, polished, stripped of its soul, as if it had been born in some conference room rather than through years of quiet work behind glass. The structure, the grid, the language, mine. Not just the theory, but the anomaly markers, the conditional thresholds, the predictive triggers I had refined and hidden in notebooks no one else had ever touched. I hit pause and took a slow breath. In that moment, there were 2 versions of me. The first, the sister, the daughter, wanted to believe it was a mistake. That maybe Lauren had misunderstood the origins, been misinformed, or simply didn't know where the foundation of EMR had come from. But the second, the observer, knew better. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. She hadn't just used EMR, she had rebranded it. Stripped away its operational language, wrapped it in friendly civilian terminology, stamped her team's logo on top, and filed it neatly under military-civilian liaison strategy. Most importantly, she had made herself the face of it. I didn't call her. I didn't write. I just shut the laptop, sat perfectly still, and then walked downstairs. From under the workbench, I dragged out the old steel case I hadn't opened in years. Inside were 16 battered field notebooks, printed logs from every training session, the original sketch of the EMR Diamond model, and a flash drive marked Logan version 4. I spread them out like exhibits in a courtroom, not because I wanted to strike back. Not yet. But because I needed the truth to stand on something solid. I began cataloging timestamps, handwritten entries, and file versions. From the earliest pencil diagrams to the working prototypes I had submitted under restricted review, not one contained her name. I built a timeline: first sketch, month 1, year 1, initial field test, month 4, first PTSD trace crossmatch, month 6. Lauren didn't even join Dignia Solutions until month 9. She hadn't been in the building when EMR was born. She hadn't sat through the breakdowns or breakthroughs. She simply waited, and then stepped in. I didn't shout. I didn't weep. I just whispered to the empty room, "This isn't about credit. It's about history being rewritten without me in it." And history, I'd learned, was more delicate than memory. So I started reconstructing mine, line by line. When the day came, I wouldn't just be protecting a concept. I'd be protecting the truth of who I'd always been, long before anyone thought it worth acknowledging. It wasn't always this way between us. Back when our bedrooms were separated by nothing but a thin wall, we'd stay up talking into the early hours, our dreams overlapping. She used to braid my hair before school. I used to write speeches for her student council campaigns. We weren't just sisters, we were reflections. So when she called me 2 years ago asking for help, I didn't hesitate. "Hey," she said, voice casual but edged, "we're working on a non-profit pilot, civil-military trust building. There's a behavioral piece I think you'd be perfect for." I asked, "You mean something like trauma-informed leadership?" "Exactly. Just something light, a framework, nothing public-facing," she replied. She wondered if I had any existing templates she could use as an icebreaker for a cross-functional discussion. I sent her a stripped-down demo of EMR, basic schematics only, non-sensitive output. I even added a note, "Use as context only. Not validated for external use." She texted back, "Got it. You're the best. Love you." That was the last time we spoke. I forgot about it, burying myself in other work. Until the hearing. Until her face was on every network. That wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculated repackaging. Because what she presented to Congress wasn't a concept draft. It was the full model, rebuilt, renamed, and rolled out under a shiny coalition banner, Coalition for Civilian Defense Alignment. Their tagline? Bridging hearts before conflict. And there it was, my phrasing, cleaned up and welded to a political agenda. She hadn't just used EMR. She had licensed it. Filed it as a proprietary method. Applied for funding. And she'd launched training modules, word for word the ones I had written for internal mentoring. One night, I found myself staring at the trademark filings. Lead architect, Lauren J. Collins. I read it again and again until the words stopped meaning anything. Then I remembered the demo. The favor. The trust. The blind spot I thought sisterhood protected. I whispered, I wasn't deceived because I trusted her. I was deceived because I thought she understood me. Trust assumes truth. Understanding assumes care. She had given me neither. She didn't just lift my work, she translated it into a version where I ceased to exist. For what? Recognition? Influence? Or had it always been easier to build a career from borrowed bricks as long as the house looked perfect from the street? I don't know. But that night, I unlocked my encrypted archive, the one I hadn't opened since EMR's pilot years. There it was, the original transmission log, the email containing the demo file, the permissions tag set to internal only. And I remembered something smaller, an offhand text she'd sent after receiving it, "This is genius. You could change everything with this. But knowing you, you'll just hide and let someone else present it." I'd brushed it off then. But now, it read like a map. A confession. She'd known exactly what she was doing, and I had given her the keys. I opened a new document, titled it EMR, Genesis File Timeline, Author, HC. And I began typing, because some truths don't die. They just wait for someone to speak them again. I had no intention of being found. I'd made peace with my invisibility. Quiet work. Real work. That was enough. Until the emails started. Not from attorneys or officials, but from soldiers. One by one. Some short, just a single line of thanks. Others longer, memories of moments in the field. You looked at me like I wasn't broken. You stopped a panic spiral by asking what I was afraid of, not what I was supposed to do. I read them in solitude. I never replied. Until I saw a name I recognized. Logan. He'd been one of my first. Back then, his hands trembled constantly, his gaze darting toward corners where no threat existed. Using EMR, we discovered the core wasn't fear, it was guilt, misplaced and unresolved. That changed everything for him. His email was short: "I'm on Senator Hall's team now. If you ever want the truth told, I can get you 6 minutes in the right room." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure if I wanted truth or revenge. But something in the air was shifting. Heavy. Like a wave far offshore, building speed. Then came the notification: Closed Military Civilian Innovation Conference, Limited Access Stream. The title: Neuroethical Systems in Strategic Morale Leadership. The subtitle made my stomach knot: Honoring Breakthroughs in Emotional Cognitive Mapping, the EMR Initiative. I logged in. The feed opened to a dim stage lit in soft blue, rows of uniforms sitting in silence. The moderator stepped forward. "Today," he announced, "we honor the team that redefined readiness, not only as physical capacity, but as emotional coherence." Applause. "And now, please welcome the woman whose vision made it possible, Director of Strategic Outreach, Harper Collins." The lights shifted, applause swelled, and there she was, my sister, in a deep navy pantsuit, radiant and confident. She stepped onto that stage as if it had been built for her. I stayed still. I listened as she spoke. "When we first envisioned EMR," Lauren began, "we thought it would be a gentle tool. But over time, it proved to be the strongest force for unit cohesion we've ever seen." I realized she wasn't just speaking, she was editing history in real time. The audience nodded along, jotting down notes. One general even stood and said, "This system has saved lives. It should be standard across all training environments." I wanted to close the stream, but I didn't. I watched until the final round of applause faded. Then I opened Logan's email again and read his line: "If you ever want the truth told." For the first time, I wasn't thinking about reputation or revenge. I was thinking about distortion, about how easily the narrative had been bent until my silence made me part of the lie. Lauren hadn't just taken EMR, she had removed its guardrails, the context, the cautions, the warnings written into its design. She'd turned a precision instrument into a glossy brand, and they were preparing to deploy it on a massive scale. That night, I stood at my kitchen sink, fingers wrapped around a mug of cold tea. Outside, the street lay still. Inside, everything roared. I murmured to myself, if someone gets hurt because of this. I didn't finish the thought, but I already knew its ending, and I knew what I had to do. Logan's message sat in my inbox for 4 days before I replied. I told him I wasn't ready to go public, but I needed a name, someone who still had access to the original EMR drafts I'd submitted during the trial phase. The private logs I wasn't supposed to keep. He sent me one: Dr. Elliot Harmon. Back in the early days, he had been our ethics advisor, quiet, sharp, always a step ahead. He had also been custodian of the intellectual property waivers, the final signature on whether my work could be used beyond our unit. The trail was faint, but I found him, retired now, living in a modest home near the Chesapeake Bay. His porch swing was faded from salt air, and a calico cat named Tuesday wove around his legs when he opened the door. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Just tired. Come in," he said. I figured this day would come. We sat at his kitchen table. The air smelled of coffee and damp wood. I asked if he still had the signed originals, the logs, the consent records, anything linking EMR's authorship to me. He gave me a long look before saying, "I did." Past tense. 3 years earlier, he'd been pressured into transferring ownership. No guns, no shouting, just quiet threats wrapped in legal jargon. "I wasn't forced at gunpoint, Harper," he said, "but I was forced." My stomach turned. By who? He hesitated, then sighed. "Lauren's legal team." I stayed silent. He went on. They'd framed it as a necessary reassignment for the greater good, to ensure the program's implementation. They mentioned his pension, his license, his son's position at the agency. "It wasn't theft exactly," he said, "but it was cornering." He lowered his eyes to his coffee. "They had leverage. I had a mortgage." I wanted to be angry, but I understood too well how slow, steady coercion worked. I asked if he regretted it. He nodded. Then he said something that lodged in my chest: they've already erased your name. But they haven't drawn the new picture yet. Don't let them sketch you with their pen. I asked if he had anything left. Any scrap of evidence. He stood, disappeared into the back room, and returned with a thin black notebook. My handwriting. Originals. Diagrams. Case notes. Emotional coding. One page even held a coffee ring and a smear of red ink from a pen that had burst in my hand during a late-night session. This won't win in court, he said. But if you use it right, it might win in hearts. I clutched it, my hands trembling. Outside, the wind was rising. Inside, so was something else, resolve. Elliot walked me to the door. As I stepped out, he said, I'm old. I've got nothing left to lose. But you do. So be careful. And be the one to tell your story. I nodded. And I knew where I had to go next. Someone I trusted. Someone who knew what it was to be erased and rebuilt as someone else's victory. A former Marine turned journalist. She'd once told me, stories don't die, they just wait for the right voice. It was time I found mine again. Still, I didn't submit the file. Not yet. I wasn't sure whether the world needed the truth, or whether I just needed to be free from my silence. Then one night, a new email arrived. Subject line, a gift you can't return. Sender, Marcus Ellis, a Marine I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. I'd flagged him during training as high risk, unresolved survivor's guilt, buried grief, and trauma so deeply pressed down it came out sideways as humor. EMR had detected it in his disrupted REM patterns and in the way he deflected in every debrief. We'd gotten him the help he needed, quietly. Now he was thanking me. But more than that, he was acting. Attached was a press inquiry. Fox News was working on an exposé. They'd uncovered discrepancies between internal authorship logs and EMR's official launch files. Marcus had tipped them off. The series had a title, Who is the Woman Behind EMR? The teaser aired at 6:30 p.m. that Thursday. I didn't see it. I was at my parents' house. Lauren had gathered everyone to celebrate her latest consulting deal with the Federal Tech Coalition. The table was crowded. Glasses clinked. My mother wore pearls. My father made his usual joke about how Lauren always landed on her feet. I sat at the far end, quiet. A cousin asked if I'd gone back to school. I didn't answer. Then, in the middle of the laughter, my uncle reached for the remote. Let's see what's going on in the big world, he said. Fox News Prime Hour filled the screen. A bold red and white title card flashed, EMR, the future of conflict resolution. Underneath, born from the mind of a ghost. No photo. Just data. Then the headline, Harper Collins, 34, U.S. Navy Analytical Command, nominated for Rear Admiral. The room froze. Forks hovered midair. Glasses paused. My mother's smile faltered, then vanished. My father blinked slowly. The reporter's voice carried on. Sources within the Department of Defense confirm that the emotional mapping model now being adopted by NATO intelligence units originated not from a communications division, but from a data psychologist embedded within classified training facilities between 2015 and 2019. That name, Harper Collins. No one spoke. Not Lauren. Not the cousin who once called me the dropout with a laptop. Not the aunt who used to ask if I was still doing that feeling stuff. They all looked at me. And I said nothing, because what could I say? I hadn't planned this. I hadn't leaked a thing. I hadn't asked to be seen. But I wasn't hiding anymore either. I leaned back in my chair. The TV kept rolling, blurred silhouettes, thermal maps, quotes from unnamed insiders. My name hung in the air like smoke no one dared wave away. Finally, Lauren stood, picked up her glass, and walked into the kitchen without a word. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible, but I didn't feel victorious either. I just felt still. Like the world had gone quiet, and the truth had finally taken shape, wearing my name. I didn't follow her. I stayed at the table. The conversation stumbled, then lurched back to life. Forced jokes. My aunt pivoted to talk about a cousin's baby shower. But the undercurrent had changed, and everyone felt it. I left early. No one stopped me. That night, I lay on my bed, still in my clothes, staring at the ceiling as if it might answer me. I didn't sleep. At 2:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. Lauren. Her name alone made my chest tighten. I almost ignored it. But I opened it. Her message was short. I didn't know. You never told me. Don't blame me for protecting my career. No punctuation. No explanation. Just that. I didn't answer. I turned the phone face down on the windowsill, but her words echoed louder than the news segment. I didn't know. It was true, I'd never told her everything about EMR. Not the code architecture, not the failed tests, not the nights I stayed awake rewriting intervention scripts for soldiers who didn't know how to cry. I had given her fragments, diagrams, surface-level observations, because she asked. And I sent them because, for a brief second, I wanted her to see me. I hadn't realized how deep I'd buried that hope. Now I couldn't tell if this was betrayal or just the consequence of my own silence. I thought about Marcus's offer. About the hearing request sitting in my inbox. About the nomination that had passed through half a dozen offices before landing in mine, each forwarding it like a footnote in a history I had nearly been erased from. I thought about Lauren, how she always spoke the right words at the right time, how she learned to survive by fitting in. How we were both daughters in a house where being good meant being quiet, and being right didn't guarantee anyone listened. So I asked myself, what was I fighting for? Recognition? Justice? Or was it smaller, and deeper? Was I trying to prove I mattered? Trying to rewrite the years I'd been dismissed and made to believe my empathy was a liability? Was this even about EMR? Or was it about me? I looked at my oldest code folder. The first version still had its original name, MRE Alpha V1. Not Lauren. Not even my own name, just letters for mapping. The start of something I hadn't been brave enough to claim until now. Her text kept circling in my head, don't blame me for protecting my career. I whispered into the dark, then don't blame me for reclaiming mine. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I opened my laptop and began gathering everything, documentation, emails, timestamps, trial reports, even the water-stained notebook I'd hidden behind the radiator vent. I didn't send them anywhere yet. First, I needed to face the truth. This wasn't just about setting the record straight. This was about ending the silence that had shaped every corner of my life. If this was a war, it wasn't between me and Lauren, it was between the woman I'd learned to be just to survive and the woman I was meant to be. And this time, I wouldn't hide. They called it an honor, a rare appointment, strategic advisor to the Joint Armed Command. Civilian status. Full access. Lifetime clearance. A seat at the table where doctrine was written, not just executed. I received the envelope in person. A colonel in full dress slid it across a polished mahogany desk as if handing over a medal. He told me to take my time, but his smile said he already knew my answer. I didn't open it right away. I walked home, no motorcade, no escort, just my boots on the sidewalk and the weight of history knocking against my ribs. That night, I broke the seal. Inside was a mission report from an active conflict zone overseas. I knew the region, knew its fragile alliances. What I didn't know, what no one had told me, was that EMR was fully deployed there. The report detailed a moral deadlock. 2 possible objectives. 1. Reach a besieged village where civilians were trapped. 2. Rescue an injured commanding officer, codenamed Falcon, carrying vital intelligence. Time sensitive. No way to split forces. EMR's analysis, based on behavioral modeling, field history, and trend projections, recommended Falcon's rescue. The team followed the recommendation. Falcon survived. The civilians didn't. The summary called it a tactical success. My chest tightened. I turned to the annex. EMR had flagged soldiers who hesitated, logged their emotional deviations, and recommended desensitization training. Desensitization. I shut the report. Then I pulled out my oldest trial notebook. On the very first page, in blue ink blurred by rain, was the thesis line I'd written before EMR even had a name. No decision made under extreme stress is purely strategic. It is always emotional. That's not a flaw. That's human. Somewhere along the line, they'd taken the engine I built to keep soldiers from breaking and turned it into a filter for erasing empathy. That wasn't my EMR. But it was the one they had refined, and now they wanted me to bless it with my name. I looked at the insignia in the folder. Admiral, if I accepted. Civilian, if I declined. I didn't sleep. At 6:45 a.m., I walked back into headquarters and placed the envelope on the colonel's desk. His brow furrowed. "I thought this would be your redemption," he said. "It is," I replied. He waited. "I built something right," I told him softly. "But I forgot to teach them how to be human with it." He tilted his head. I nodded toward the folder. When data becomes a shield against morality, no badge can fix that. Then I left. No applause. No cameras. Just a choice made in full daylight. I didn't need a title to know who I was, and I wouldn't let my name be used to legitimize something I never intended to create. The hall was full: decorated officers, think tank strategists, contractors in tailored suits, veterans and bureaucrats alike. They sat in neat rows of polished metal chairs in the National Defense Convention Center. I stood at the podium. No rank on my shoulders. No uniform. Just me, and a microphone, humming faintly in the stillness. They had invited me to speak about innovation, but celebration wasn't why I came. I was asked to talk about technology, I began evenly, but I'm here to talk about consequences. The room went still. I didn't leave the service because I was exhausted, I continued. I left because I couldn't keep watching us trade empathy for efficiency. Because somewhere along the way, strategy got sanitized. I glanced toward the front row, no sign of Lauren. EMR wasn't built to justify sacrifice. It was designed to recognize pain before it turns into violence. And now, it's being used to make choices without the weight of human conscience. A ripple moved through the audience. Some shifted in their seats. I was offered a promotion, admiral. I declined. Not for lack of ambition, but because I refused to let my name legitimize decisions I would never stand behind. Behind me, the projector lit up. I clicked the remote. On the screen, one sentence appeared: civilian exposure risk is within acceptable strategic loss thresholds. I let it sit there. Let them read it. Let them taste it. That line came from the last report I reviewed, I said. It was a decision based on EMR data. But no one asked if it was right, only if it was acceptable. A man in a Navy uniform stood. If you had the power, would you risk the mission to save civilians? I held his gaze. Drew a breath. I'd risk more than the mission. I'd risk being wrong, if it meant being decent. Applause broke from one side of the room. Boos from the other. The room split down the middle. By evening, military blogs were running their headlines: too sensitive to lead, Harper Collins' dangerous idealism. But another headline began climbing in reach: moral clarity in uniform, why Harper Collins might be right. That night, walking toward the parking garage, a young corporal caught up with me. "Ma'am, because of EMR," he said quietly, "I asked for help. That system didn't just save my mind, it saved my life." I nodded but didn't speak. At home, I cried for the first time in years. Weeks passed. No calls. No texts. Not even a casual "how are you?" from anyone in my family. Then I found a podcast. My sister's voice, polished, steady, corporate smooth. The interviewer asked, "Do you think Harper deserved credit for EMR?" Lauren hesitated. "I think I need to be forgiven," she finally said. I paused the audio. Closed my laptop. Stared out the window for a long time. Forgiven. I wasn't even sure what that meant anymore. The next morning, in my EMR ethics seminar, I used her quote as a discussion prompt. We debated the difference between apology and accountability. Olivia, a 22-year-old still learning how to steady her voice, raised her hand. "Do you forgive your family, Miss Collins?" I took a slow breath. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think I've stopped needing them to change." The room was quiet, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully. "We often confuse forgiveness with closure," I added. "They're not the same. Forgiveness is accepting the truth for what it is, and refusing to let it dictate what you build next." After class, I returned to my office. On my desk sat an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. Inside, a letter. "Harper, they still use EMR quietly, when it matters most. One day, we were ready to greenlight a mission. The data said go. But I remembered your words, no decision without human weight." I stopped. We waited. Found something the system missed. 2 lives were saved. One was mine. Logan. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. Logan had been one of my earliest cases, one of the reasons I hadn't walked away for good. I went to the same bench along the Potomac River where I used to sit when I had no clearance and no name. And I realized something. Maybe there'd never be an apology. Maybe my family would never reach out. Maybe Lauren would never say the words I once thought I needed to hear. But that bench was mine. That letter was mine. And the students teaching EMR principles to a new generation, leaders who might actually lead with heart, they were mine too. I no longer needed anyone else to remember who I was. I had never forgotten. That was enough. I called it the lighthouse. Not a clinic. Not a school. Not even a facility, just a place that knew how to stay lit when the rest of the world went dark. We opened in an old community center just outside Arlington. The rent was low. The ceilings leaked when it rained. But the windows faced the sunrise, and that was enough. No military logos. No flags. No ranks on the wall. People came as they were, uniformed, civilian, bruised, unsure. Some carried files. Some carried silence. We didn't fix anyone. We didn't promise answers. We gave them space to feel, loudly, honestly, without shame. We gave them questions for when answers were too heavy. On their first day, every newcomer got a small card. You are not broken. You were trained to endure. Now you are learning to be whole. It came from one of my earliest EMR lectures. I'd said it offhand once, and someone had scribbled it down. Years later, it hung framed in our main hallway. One wall in the foyer was intentionally left bare except for one thing, the transcript of my speech declining the admiral's rank. Printed on parchment. Sealed under glass. At the top, bolded. I didn't leave because I couldn't lead. I left because leadership meant more than winning. Visitors read it in silence. Some cried. A Marine veteran, 62, a scar tracing his jaw, medals covering his chest, stood in front of it for 15 minutes without moving. When he finally turned to me, he said, "I thought I'd never hear someone say that out loud." Neither did I told him. We kept no client records. Asked for no discharge papers. Cared nothing for whether someone left the service honored or dishonored. One man arrived wearing his dishonorable discharge patch openly. "I have nowhere else to go," he said. We found him a chair, a mug of coffee, and a name tag. Workshops came and went. Written exercises, group talks. But the most powerful moments were always the quiet ones, someone admitting they were scared, someone whispering they didn't know who they were without the uniform, someone laughing for the first time in years. We never posted photos. No media tours. No PR campaigns. But word spread. Some called us radical. Some called us naive. But more people came. Harper Collins built a place where ghosts and warriors could sit at the same table, speak without ranks, and heal without hiding. One night, I stayed late to mop the floor. A sticky patch near the entrance wouldn't come up. As I scrubbed, I looked up at my own words framed on the wall. I left because leadership meant more than winning. And I whispered to myself, maybe this is what leadership really looks like. It was a gray, rain-slick Wednesday when she arrived. No cameras, no staff, just a damp coat clinging to her sleeves and eyes that didn't flinch away this time. Lauren stood in the doorway of the lighthouse, hands buried in her pockets. For a second, I thought she might turn back. But she stayed. I met her halfway across the lobby. No handshake. No embrace. Just a space between us that was heavy, but not hostile. She glanced around, the folding table with coffee, the bulletin board lined with anonymous thank you notes, the shelf with a stack of small welcome cards. Her gaze settled on the quote framed on the wall, "I didn't leave because I couldn't lead. I left because leadership meant more than winning." I read it, she said quietly. I nodded. We didn't sit. She didn't ask to see the rest of the building. She stood the way people do when they aren't sure they belong. "You may never forgive me," she said. And I get that. But EMR, it was never really mine. I'm filing to restore the authorship under your name, full rights, copyright, everything. She wasn't crying. Neither was I. But something shifted, like a rusted door clicking open after years of silence. I didn't thank her. I didn't speak at all. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I'd spent years chasing the right words, only to learn that some moments aren't meant for them. We stood there for another few breaths. Then she added, "I still don't know how to talk to you, but I'd like to try." She left without theatrics, no long look back, no dramatic exit, just the sound of rain and the soft thud of the door closing. Back in my office, I sat in the old chair that squeaked if you leaned too far. My eyes landed on the photo I'd kept face down for years, 2 little girls on a beach, matching ponytails, one holding a toy microphone, the other pretending to run a radio tower. I'd flipped it over the day she stood at that congressional podium. It had stayed that way ever since. Now, with steadier hands than I expected, I turned it upright again. No speeches, no reconciliation ceremony, just gravity realigning itself. Somewhere between loss and repair, a new kind of memory had begun to form. And for now, that was enough. They came in quietly, some in uniform, others in worn hoodies. One woman with a sociology textbook balanced on her lap. A young man with a prosthetic hand resting naturally on the desk. It was the first session of the new EMR course at the lighthouse. I stood at the front of the room holding a stick of chalk. No projector. No podium. Just a blackboard and the soft gold of afternoon light. "You're not here because someone needed another line on their resume," I began. A few smiles, a cough from the back row. "You're here because somewhere, someone is carrying more than they're allowed to feel. And one day it might be your voice, your presence, that tells them they're not broken, just buried." The silence in the room settled into a tension. I stepped toward the window, watching the curtains shift like it was breathing. "When I built EMR, it wasn't to make waves," I said. "It was to prevent drownings." Notebooks opened. Pens moved. "But I want to be clear, this course isn't about me. You don't have to remember my name. What matters is that you remember this." I turned to the board and wrote 6 words in bold white chalk, no applause needed. "Just live true." When I stepped aside, a shaft of sunlight caught the letters perfectly. "You may never get a headline," I told them. "You may never get a medal. In fact, the louder you speak the truth, the more some will try to erase you." I paused, meeting the eyes of the young man with the prosthetic. "That doesn't mean you're wrong." They didn't clap. They didn't need to. Some truths don't echo, they take root. Quiet. Steady. Exactly where they're meant to grow. And that was the point.